progress.
I'm Tori Bedford. Tonight on Greater Boston, as polls close across New Hampshire, we'll take a last look at the Republican and Democrat primary races, how voters have been turning out, and how this primary sets the stage for all the rest. Plus, is Donald Trump losing Gen Z? GBH News talked to a pair of college students who went for Trump in the last election on where they stand now. And finally, could funding problems keep the Healey administration from fixing the T? GBH News' transportation reporter Bob Seay joins me. As the final votes roll in from New Hampshire, Nikki Haley is trying to disabuse Trump of the idea that he's already won.
Former President Trump last night said you'll probably drop out today. What's your response to that? I don't do what he tells me to do. I've never done what he tells me to do. We're going to South Carolina.
With an early look at how the race is shaping up, I'm joined by New Hampshire Public Radio reporter Todd Bookman in Exeter and Washington Post national politics reporter Hannah Knowles in Manchester. Thank you both so much for joining me. Before we jump into this conversation, I wanted to just play a little bit of tape from voters in New Hampshire casting their ballots today.
I vote for Nikki Haley. She's for the military. And we have families in the military.
Nikki Haley. I'm tired of the craziness, 4 years of crazy. We don't need any more of that. It's been 8 years.
President Donald J. Trump, he stands for freedom. We're getting our freedoms taken away, left and right. It's like a communist country.
He's real. He's not a politician. He's just like me. He's just like me, but he has more money.
I stayed with Joe. He's kind. He's not a bully. He's more of a president.
So, Todd, you've been out all day on the ground, not just today, but what are you hearing from voters?
Well, we're hearing a lot of what you just heard, which is that there is no sort of monolith. There is no standard New Hampshire voter. Everybody is out here today motivated by something different. I've spoken with a lot of people who were excited to write in Joe Biden's name. I've spoken with other Democrats who were more or less holding their nose to do that. They would have preferred to see somebody perhaps younger enter the race. On the Republican side, we've seen certainly a lot of enthusiasm among the more independent-minded voters to pull for Nikki Haley. And yet there are certainly a large number of Republican-based voters out here voting for Donald Trump. And so you see a little bit of everything so far.
There's been so much talk about a possible Nikki Haley victory. We just got these poll results from yesterday from Suffolk University showing a Trump lead slightly widened after Ron DeSantis dropped out. You know, there's a margin of error, but there's more than 20-point lead as of yesterday. You know, if there is this possibility of victory for Haley, why don't the numbers reflect that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I think the expectations here got very high for Haley because she was the only rival who seemed to have a shot at Trump, even if it was still a distant shot. And so I think, that got a lot of people excited. They thought maybe she can even pull off an upset here. And that sort of crashed into this reality of even in Trump's weakest state against his strongest rival, that still could be, way less than enough to beat him.
And Todd, can you talk a little bit about how the turnout will impact Haley? I mean, if she either defeats Trump or loses to Trump by a smaller margin than he's expecting, I mean, he's expecting a landslide victory, how will that affect her moving forward?
Yeah, what we've heard from a lot of political analysts is that Haley wants to see big turnout today. She definitely wants to see big turnout amongst independent voters. At the polling locations I've traveled to so far today, we're hearing reports of very steady, very good turnout, but certainly nothing approaching record-setting level. So we'll just have to wait and see what that means for Haley's supporters. Moving on after tonight, it will be up to Haley and her campaign to figure out how they want to potentially spin a second place finish, whether it's a close second or a distant second. And of course, if she happens to pull out a victory here, that will certainly give her campaign a boost as they head into her home state of South Carolina.
And Todd, have you heard from independent voters who are voting for Haley?
I have, yes. I was just coming from a polling place in Rye, New Hampshire, where I was speaking with an independent voter. I asked him why he voted for Nikki Haley. He basically said it was a vote against Trump. I asked him who he would vote for in November, and he said he's likely going to vote for Biden, but he viewed the vote against Trump as sort of the statement he could make at this stage in the election. I think we'll certainly see other independents go for Trump, or we'll see them also potentially write in Biden as a show of force for the Democratic campaign.
And from your perspective, Hannah, do you think that it would strengthen, would it behoove Biden if Trump was the Republican nominee, or would a Haley competition be an easier challenge?
Yeah, I think the polls are pretty clear that Haley would be a more formidable opponent for Biden. The thing is, I think what's been fascinating to a lot of us who follows this is Trump is a formidable opponent to Biden, too. I think a lot of people assumed, this guy just can't win independence after everything, he's done in the way he's divided the country. But what we've seen is he's actually quite competitive with Biden. I think if Haley is the nominee, then Democrats would be much more worried, though.
Right. I mean, I think historically it's safe to say that everyone who has underestimated Trump has been disproven, right? And he seems pretty confident about today and about New Hampshire.
Yeah, and he should be in the primary for sure. I mean, a double-digit lead is still a double-digit lead, even if it's not the, crushing landslide that he'll post in some other states probably.
I'm curious about your perspective on the DeSantis just putting everything into Iowa and then coming back around endorsing Trump. But he was this candidate who really, he was saying, I'm just like Trump, except I'm not facing all of these felony charges, right? I'm Trump, but I'm not caught up in all of this other stuff. Like, I have so many of the same ideals. Haley's on the opposite side, not the opposite side, but just offering a different choice. But she's really putting all of her energy into New Hampshire. Where do you see that going for her? What do you make of that?
Well, I think the people who are skeptical of Haley's path would say that New Hampshire is her best shot to beat Trump. And if she doesn't do it here, where else is she going to do it? Because she's gotten that one-on-one race with Trump essentially here in this state. And Haley's team is sort of trying to head that off because they know that that's probably going to be part of the narrative coming out of this primary, whatever happens. And so they've been arguing, actually, South Carolina is her home state. She still pulls way behind Trump there, but, she's definitely looking to compete hard there. And they also argue that when you get to Super Tuesday in March, that actually some of those states are demographically good for her. I think one of the examples they gave was like Virginia. I don't know, they can point to these other places where they still think it's not like this is her one shot, but some people think it is.
And just talking about these charges against Trump in this court battle, I mean, how has that affected his campaign?
It is his campaign. That's the thing about Trump, right? Like, so much of his strategy is the indictments and capitalizing on them and rallying people around him against the indictments. And, it's a choice sometimes to show up in that courtroom. It's not like he had to be there a lot of the time, but his team knows that's just, oodles of earned media for them.
Right. And he's made a lot of money off of those charges. I've heard from this primary, I've covered it in the past in 2016 and 2020. It's generally madness, right? It's just chaos. There's so much energy in Manchester and across New Hampshire. And from what I've heard of this year, it's just been a little quieter. It's been cold. It's the coldest and least interesting one so far is what I've heard from people. So I was actually relieved to see this clip of perennial candidate Vermin Supreme and Eric Trump interacting today in New Hampshire.
Got a big picture. Come on, man. Wrap your arm around this guy, man, like you.
No, hey, that's not cool. That's not cool.
I didn't touch him. I went like that.
Just back away.
I went like this. You're touching me. You can back away.
Back away.
That's fine. Okay, no worries.
So, Todd, are we seeing any of this kind of signature New Hampshire primary energy happening this year, or is it just kind of is kind of the wind gone out of the sails?
No, Vermin Supreme aside, I think a lot of the New Hampshire primary diehards would tell you that this is how it's supposed to be. You have candidates on the ground to some extent at least. But you have to also keep in mind that President Trump was really only doing one major rally here per day. In the evenings, he wasn't hitting up sort of retail locations. Nikki Haley did a huge number of stops, but towards the end of this campaign, stopped taking questions from voters at most locations. Of course, we also didn't have debates as we generally do. And the polls have been pretty clear throughout, with Trump showing a pretty sizable lead. And so, yes, on the ground, there feels like there's been some less enthusiasm. I'm here at the Exeter polling location. There's very few people holding signs outside. I've been here other years where the entire rail is sort of full of supporters for either party. And right now, when I walked through, there was only a single write-in Joe Biden person holding a sign. Ultimately, it's going to be the turnout that matters, not the excitement. And the Secretary of State is expecting a large turnout. He's predicted, 322,000 Republican ballots will be cast, which would be a pretty sizable number. And based on the polling locations I've visited, we've heard strong and steady turnout so far.
Right, and obviously you mentioned the write-in campaign for Joe Biden. What's going on the Democratic side? Are you seeing energy from other candidates? At GBH, we've spoken to a couple of different people. I know Marianne Williamson was out there. There's been a bunch of names kind of floating around about possible alternatives, and then obviously this write-in campaign. What are you seeing and hearing from voters on the Democratic side?
Right. I mean, turnout at events for Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson has not been strong. The sort of establishment Democrats have certainly gotten behind the write-in Joe Biden campaign. There's a super PAC supporting that effort. They've been flooding, Facebook ads. I've seen yard signs for the write-in Biden effort everywhere I've gone. And so I think there is some anger probably amongst a lot of Democrats in the state that Joe Biden chose not to put his name on the ballot, that he wanted South Carolina to go first. But ultimately, I think a lot of other Democrats are going to come through and vote for Biden in this primary as a show of support.
So, Hannah, I know it's difficult to make decisions. The ruling just came down in Massachusetts that Donald Trump will be on the ballot here. And obviously that's being decided in states across the country. It's difficult to make predictions about how this primary will go, but just kind of vaguely, what do you see? What do you think?
What will happen tonight, you mean?
Yeah, what's going to happen tonight?
Oh, man. Well, if the polls are right, then Nikki Haley will come closer to Trump than any other rival has, closer than, Ron DeSantis and her did in Iowa, for example. But it's still, again, it probably will still be a sizable lead. And I think that, the takeaway for a lot of people watching tonight will be, Trump basically has this in the bag. Haley's team will say they're still fighting and, there's always a shot, but it's just getting harder and harder for them.
And then on to the next primary. All right, Todd, Bookman, Hannah, Knowles, thank you so much. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Check out gbhnews.org and nhpr.org for more local coverage as the results come in. And for more 2024 coverage from the Washington Post, you can sign up for their newsletter, The Campaign Moment. Next up, ahead of today's primary, the GBH News politics team sat down with a pair of conservative New Hampshire college students who voted for Donald Trump in the last election on where they stand now. They talked before Ron DeSantis ended his campaign, but the students correctly predicted he wouldn't be in the race much longer. Let's take a look.
Trump's not carrying the 2016 wave anymore. He's basically the Grim Reaper carrying a scythe over 2020, not letting it go. 2016, when Trump won, we were all just, having that party. Second he won, that's when the fever came in. We all felt Trump.
You've mentioned that you've kind of stopped sipping the Trump juice, the President Trump juice. So who's the other candidate? I'm assuming, I think you're DeSantis.
I'm actually split between Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley. Whichever candidate wins in that race, I will back the other. Basically that one.
Yeah.
They both have strong policies.
I don't think DeSantis is going to be the name. I don't think DeSantis is the guy. I think Trump has arguably been one of the toughest presidents and most efficient.
I'll be defending Nikki Haley for this because, like I said, I'm still split because, like I said, both candidates I do like a lot. But
sorry to interrupt, but I'm just so I can get a more concrete If the election was today,
sure,
would you say you'd vote for DeSantis or Nikki Haley?
Personally, Nikki Haley. I would say that for a
Interesting.
time. But DeSantis is still my second choice. Sorry, Trump.
That's all right. You said you left the Trumpism behind.
Yeah, Afghanistan broke me, put it that way.
So what do you believe Trump's priorities to be then in this upcoming election?
Trump's backhanders were more focused on Trump's legal issues are how rigged, like I said, how bad things were in 2020. Trump's not carrying the 2016 wave anymore. He's basically carrying he's basically the Grim Reaper carrying a scythe over 2020, not letting it go. He's basically acting like a ghost of it. He's basically becoming the Christmas ghost of 2020.
I would agree with you there, and I don't think that's just a Trump thing, though. I think I'd say there's a fair portion of a lot of members of the GOP who still hold on to 2020. I think Trump's done a great job in terms of foreign policy. You seem to disagree.
I do put foreign policy first. That's because also we have an ongoing second Cold War between us and China rivalry. I'm not surprised that our adversaries and our national security risks on our northern and southern border are a priority.
I think one of the main things the GOP needs to focus on is get rid of this vendetta that the election was stolen from us. If we're going to turn out voters in the fall, we need to reaffirm voters that this isn't something that's going to happen again. The Democrats ran an amazing model in terms of what it takes to win a campaign, especially during 2020, during COVID with the mail-ins. They had their voters primed and ready, you know what I mean, to be prepared to send in those mail-in votes.
Trumpism can no longer work in this era. It worked at the time when we needed it, but it's no longer the time that we need it anymore. We need to bring back not only neoconservatism, but also but bring back the ideals that the GOP once stood for during the early 2000s, what Generation Z stood for. We remember everything during the days as being very conservative, but yet being a very fun, peaceful situation despite all the chaos and war and terror happening. The GOP was once that, but now we are a party that became nothing but revengeous. Ones that I'm scared that we become authoritarianists by accident on the far right.
I think ultimately it went pretty well with Kai. Like I said, it's always good to hear his perspectives. It was definitely interesting, his stance on really taking a firm stance on Nikki Haley and having him endorse her so much. I really don't think she's the candidate come the general. I wish I could have been fed a liberal or something like that.
Me and Nathan definitely have similar values to what the GOP needs to do, but we definitely have different tastes on the candidates. I definitely did enjoy debate with Nate a lot. I definitely think he's a great guy. We do disagree on some policies.
That was the first in a new series of conversations with Gen Z politicos called Politics IRL. Keep an eye on the GBH News YouTube page and right here on Greater Boston for more. Finally, of all the problems plaguing the MBTA, could the biggest be funding? Track work and line expansions over the past years amounted to a growing debt for the Transit Authority. Now looks to the legislature to bail them out. We discuss how we got here and what's next. GBH News transportation reporter Bob Seay joins me now. Bob, thank you so much for being here. So the biggest issue, I guess, is money. I think General Manager Philip Eng said that they'll need something like $24 billion for these repairs. That's what we're facing right now. How is that even going to be possible?
Well, it's going to be over the course of many years, but the immediate issue is really operating expenses are exceeding revenue. And even though the T has enough money to probably make it through the next fiscal year, after that, there really is that fiscal cliff that people have been talking about. And it's really going to be up to the governor and the legislature to come up with ways to supplement the funding.
So just this past week, Governor Maura Healey said that, this is a huge priority for the state. She's implemented this task force, as you mentioned, to look at different ways. What are some of the ways that they're exploring to kind of meet this and fill this gap?
Well, we can look at other transit agencies because all of them are in the same boat, really, in terms of having a lack of funding, especially since the pandemic funding is drying up from the federal government. But New York City is notable because the manager there, Richard Davies, who once headed the MBTA, really went on an all-out campaign around the state to drum up support for the MTA, and they're projecting a $1.6 billion surplus So they have really been able to put together a financial package that probably is not politically popular and certainly wouldn't be here in Massachusetts. And that's going to be the big challenge, I think. Because in New York, they're talking about payroll taxes. They're talking about driver's license fees, congestion charges, real estate transfer taxes, whatever kind of taxes and fees they need to keep the system going, they're going to try and tap. Here in Massachusetts, we haven't really even begun to talk about that. We have the millionaire's tax, which is going to produce, up to $500 million for transportation each year. But other than that, they don't want to talk about fare increases on the T, although inevitably that might be needed. And I think assessments on MBTA communities, which have dropped in the past few years, might have to go up again. But all of this is going to have to be sorted out by the governor's transportation task force, and which I understand is going to be convening in a couple of weeks. So they've got to get cracking and find a solution to this funding problem. But it's not going to be easy politically, because anytime you talk about raising fees or taxes, you're going to get a political pushback. So it will be interesting to see how they navigate this.
What has the impact been from the lack of funding, and what will the impact be if this funding is not secured?
Well, we can see the impact of inadequate funding over many years by the deterioration of the system, how it's being repaired all the time now, basically. And the original funding formula was defective. They wanted 1% of the sales tax, and they thought, that'll bring in, a certain amount of money. Well, they completely overestimated that, and that continued for several years. So it affected the ability to maintain the system, to invest in the system. And we see that the effects of the underinvestment today as people are suffering through closures and speed zone restrictions that really have been years in the making. And although they're trying to get out of them right now by fixing everything, it is going to take time and more money. The effect of not having enough funding, unfortunately, is inevitably a cut in service. And I was reading where the Washington, D.C. Metro is predicting a 60% cut in service. Something like that would be absolutely devastating, because if you cut the ridership, which is already depressed, you're going to deprive yourself of even more revenue. And it's kind of a downward death spiral for any transit agency. So it really is up to the legislature and the governor to put together a package that's going to adequately fund the T. There is a bill in Congress, and I think Congressman Seth Moulton signed on to it, that would provide $20 billion a year for 4 years for some of the major transit agencies in the country to tide them over. That will help, but it will not solve the problem. If things don't change, the T is looking at, $800 to $900 million budget deficits in 4 or 5 years, which would be really unsustainable.
We'd be looking at a lot more traffic, and also we've seen in the last couple of years, and even this month, there was an electrical fire. I think downtown Crossing, there were some issues just this past week. There are a number of issues on the Red Line and the Orange Line. A lot of that was attributed from the MBTA to extreme weather. Is that normal winter weather, or is that just a deferred maintenance issue?
No, it's the deferred maintenance. It's clear that the system is a wreck, basically. And it's been left really, it's been neglected for so many years. And anything like that, when you try to fix it, it takes more money and it takes more time to do it. And I think that basically they have a good plan on pulling the T back together. But until they do, people aren't going to be riding it, and we're going to still have that depressed ridership and depressed revenue. So it's really important that they get the system up and running as fast as they can. Other than that, there are going to be some tough times ahead for transit funding, but it's one of those things that, as you mentioned, the traffic, politically, people don't like the traffic, and if they don't like the traffic, they're going to have to address the needs of the public transit system to alleviate some of that. So I think that's what the message that has to be out there that people have to understand. And it's not going to be cheap. It is going to be expensive and time consuming, but it's something that really has to be done for the health of the city and the region.
State leaders have also pointed out that they really want to emphasize better transparency and communication. Obviously, when there are issues on the T, those things get tweeted out. But in general, just more transparency and communication around what's going on. Can you talk a little bit about the organization of the T? I mean, it's the oldest subway system in the country, right? How are they working through these issues that are decades and, I mean, more than decades old?
Well, as a person who's been covering this for the last 4 or 5 years, there has been a real change at the MBTA with the new general manager, Phil Eng, and his management team. I think you're going to see some real progressive change at the agency. The communication is still a problem. When, stuff happens, like at Downtown Crossing last week, people get off the train, they have no idea what's going on. There's no one there to tell them what to do or what the situation is. And that's something the MBTA really has to improve, its communication with the public in a more timely fashion so people have some idea of what's taking place. So that's one area they certainly can improve on.
And did they provide any kind of timeline with this task force or any kind of goals that they're hoping to meet within a specific time frame?
They haven't set any timeline, but I think most people would agree as soon as possible, especially if they're going to be preparing the budget for fiscal 26, which sounds like a long time away, but it'll be here before we know it. They really have to begin now to form the foundation for how they're going to finance the transit system.
And this has the power to transform the whole infrastructure of the city.
Yes.
I mean,
I think people, when we have these problems with the MBTA, people realize how important public transportation is. If it's not working, it affects everyone and in a negative way. And so it's really incumbent upon all the elected officials and people who are responsible for funding the T to really get their act together and make sure that that funding is available, no matter how politically unpopular it may be. People don't like new taxes and they don't like new fees, but that may be what we have to do in order to get enough money to run the transit system that we want.
Great. GBH News transportation reporter Bob Seay, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, great to be with you.
And if you have questions for Bob on all things transportation, you can send them our way at greaterboston@wgbh.org or in the comments below if you're watching on YouTube. That's it for tonight, but come back tomorrow. I'm Tori Bedford. Thanks for watching. Good night.